This month's Where Did the Road Go is sponsored by Allison Cook, Lindsay Trebet, and Super Inframan. If you'd like to help support the show, you can do so at wheredidtheroadgo.com. And now our show.
Transmission start. Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? Join us as we wander off the path and explore lost history, consciousness, the paranormal, unexplained mysteries, alternative thought, and much more. We are present on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Now here is your host, Seriah.
Welcome to this edition of Where Did the Road Go? And tonight I am here with Mr. Brent Raynes again, making your return to the show. Hi, Brent.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. And the last time you were on was for your latest book on Jung, Keel. And that's still your latest book, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, okay. It is.
And I think we did 3 parts on that. And then you went and you sent me your first book, Visitors from Hidden Realms.
Yeah, from 2004.
Yeah, the origin and destiny of humanity is told by star elders, shaman, and UFO visitors. And as I was telling you before, first of all, I loved this book. This book was a great read. And it's so relevant to the stuff that's being talked about today. Like you were way ahead of everyone on this with this book.
Well, I'm glad to hear you say that, Seriah. But I can tell you that on Amazon, I got some rough reviews.
Oh, I'm sure. Well, because you're comparing, as I have many times, you're comparing like some of these UFO encounters with shamanism and things like that, and You're talking about supernatural Bigfoot, interdimensional beings. I mean, this is stuff that some people don't want to hear.
Right. I was so honored that Brad Steiger wrote the introduction, because he was one of the authors and researchers who pioneered this whole area of exploration. The Native Americans. He had written a book, in fact, years earlier on this. The subject of had interviews with Native American people, and of course I interviewed him in this book too about his experiences in Peru and such, and where he and his wife Sherry had actually had a sighting over a body of water of some very strange lights, and the people in this village were just going about their usual day-to-day activities like it was no big deal, And the shaman told them, oh, this is very common. They were seeing these objects coming out of the water, going into the water. And Sherry claimed that she was actually able to communicate. I mean, just, tell it, I want you to do this or to do that. And the light in the sky would perform whatever maneuver she asked it to.
And that's not the first time I've heard a story like that.
No, I remember Chris O'Brien also has a similar story of an experience that he and some others had years ago up in New York State, where they were watching these lights in the sky, and they started to tell them what they wanted them to do. And yeah, these kind of stories always interest me the most, the high strangeness, the crossover type phenomena. It to me shows us that the phenomenon is really much more complex and perplexing than a lot of the mainstream nuts and bolts ET crowd tend to feel it is,
Yeah.
But
and I think that would be why you got bad reviews on Amazon, because so many people are in that camp, and they occasionally get very upset if you're proposing something other than the sort of materialist paradigm.
Yeah, but I've been surprised that with the John Keel book that because he was certainly a very controversial personality, and I mean, I got into some high strangeness stuff there, as you know, and yet the response has been, and I think maybe it's a matter of timing too. I think there's a growing interest in Keel, and a lot of people are exploring things now more than back in the day when he was bringing these matters up, talking about a parallel world and elemental beings, the similarities and stuff. I mean, you got Jacques Vallée, of course, plowing through similar terrain, and right now you've had Free Organization, which is now CCRI, the Consciousness Contact Research Institute, with people with PhDs and MDs who are studying a lot of the high strangeness stuff, and so there's more openness, I think, that's evolving. At least I hope so.
Yeah. So in this, let's see, I'm going to go back to one of the first things I was going to ask you about is Brad Steiger. And one of the things we had talked about right before we started recording is that throughout this book and throughout the other book, I mean, you just randomly mention talking to various people, and it's just like you knew everyone that are big names. Like you've talked to everybody in these fields, it seems like.
Well, we connect with a lot of people, like doing interviews like you and I are doing right now.
Right.
And I noticed you've just had one of your shows, not this one, but I think another one you do for the radio station for 25 years now, right?
26.
26. Okay.
Yes.
That's
my metal show.
Okay. Well, maybe a different field, but I'm sure you've made a lot of connections there too.
Oh yeah, definitely. And this show wouldn't exist if that show didn't exist. When I started doing this, I had radio on my mind. I wasn't thinking podcast.
Yeah.
So that kind of led to this.
Yeah. How long have you been doing this one?
6.5. It was beginning of 2013. So however long that is now.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's 7 years.
A little over 7.
That's pretty cool. And I know you've been doing a lot of interviews.
Yeah. Well, it both feels like I just started and also like I've been doing it forever. It's like it's always been there, but it hasn't. But at the same time, it feels still new to me.
Well, there's a lot of people out there. I just it's kind of like a vanity publication, or when you interview people, or interview system, you can actually reach out to people that asking that have information that you're interested in. Like I interviewed Jacques Vallée after meeting him and reading Confrontations and some of his other books, but I was really interested in the whole story about the incidents down in Colares, the island of Colares, at the mouth of the Amazon in Brazil. And I had already interviewed Bob Pratt, the author of UFO Danger Zone, who had also been down there. And so it's really pretty cool when you have a publication, a platform to a podcast, and you can reach out to these people and they're willing to share their stories and accounts and further your own knowledge at the same time.
Oh, yeah.
And nothing like getting this stuff firsthand,
Definitely.
But
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Well, that was, and so much of this has evolved. I mean, since then, recently, I've been corresponding with Gary Nolan, who is working with Christopher Kit Green. They're two very qualified medical specialists who are studying a lot of UFO experiencers, over 100 so far. And they're looking at doing MRI studies of their brains, looking at what's different from their brain as compared to, a regular person. And they've pinpointed some areas that seem to be one particular area that seems to have more of a neural makeup, neurofibers or whatever. And they think maybe it's not the antenna for these experiences, but it may be somewhere close by. And, of course, Kit Green got interested in this going way back to 1972 to I think about 1986 when he worked at the CIA's Weird Desk, and he was working with people like Uri Geller and Ingo Swann and Russ Targ and all those people involved with the remote viewing project.
Right.
And Jacques Vallée was, I found out when I met him back 2005 at a conference, he was actually involved early on in that and called in as a consultant because so many of these people like Swann and Geller were, I guess from an early age, experiencers with UFO phenomena, and they wondered, is there some relevance to that? And I found out that Gary Nolan and Kit Green, I learned this from some correspondence with Gary Nolan, that they've had a number of conversations with Jacques Vallée recently, and one of the subjects that keeps turning up is the incidents back in the 70s on the island of Colares in Brazil, where there were about 35 or 36 people who received injuries there from a beam of light. They had a high level of UFO activity, and I don't know of many cases this bizarre, but I mean, there was one medical doctor, a lady doctor, on this island who was treating the injury people. Generally was on the chest area, a red place, and then there would be like in the middle of it, like puncture marks.
Yeah.
And this is in Valley's Confrontations and Bob Pratt's UFO Danger Zone. And the military was there, and regular news people were there. And in Confrontation, Valley mentions that there was some American corporation that apparently came around and gathered up all the negatives from the newspaper people, bought them. So he comments in the book that someone here in the United States has a powerful collaborative, positive evidence that these things are real because they have the negatives. And in Bob Pratt's interview, he describes a woman who claimed that not only seeing the object shoot this beam at her, but actually it was like a little man in a diving suit with little beady eyes, and he held up this thing like some sort of a gun and shot this ray at her. And the witnesses claimed that when it hit them, it was like a cigarette being put on your flesh, the hot end.
Right.
And then the light beam would kind of like retract away from them. And there seemed to be like it was maybe a blood, like, spots of blood, like there'd been, blood taken or something. And they'd be sick for 4 or 5 days afterwards, dizzy and nauseated. And 2 people, in fact, had died after this, after the doctor had examined them. And she thought that maybe one case, was maybe the person's heart condition. Right. I think she wanted to autopsy, and an Army official told her no, they were just going to bury him. And Gary Nolan told me that unfortunately it was an intriguing case, but they didn't have any physical evidence, no blood samples or anything to study. But they're working with other experiences, a lot of people who military backgrounds, night security, people considered reliable, and I think they've got over 100 of those. And at the, locally, the doctor at first thought that this was just, they were just having kind of like psychosomatic reactions to a belief in some sort of vampire type spirit in the air called Chupa Chupa,
Yeah.
Maybe they might ought to re-examine that idea. I don't know. There was certainly something very bizarre going on.
Well, that also takes you into the chupacabra stuff you write about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of strange stuff there. I sent a copy of my book to John Keel, and he wrote back. He said, well, I see you you did try to do the same thing I did, he says, and essentially you end up with just, unable to really prove anything. He said it's all speculation, but anyway, then he went on a spiel about, we're pretty much the world is going to hell in a handbasket, and churches are failing us, and doom and gloom.
Yes, he did seem to have a very bleak outlook on things.
Yeah, he did. And I was told that, it was kind of rough being in the same space sometimes. Some people, they had to sometimes they could only take so much and then have to kind of distance themselves. 'Cause it asked him how he was doing, and there was usually a lot of times kind of a sad story to that. And he was having, in his, a lot of health problems.
Right.
And such. And of course, I think he was, perhaps disappointed in his career that it didn't go as far as, being accepted. Certainly in the UFO field, he was not well received, because he often was criticized, but he often gave as good as he got too. He had an acid wit, and you never knew quite how he was going to take something. Even his best friends, Doug Skinner told me, even he was the best friend, to him, and he would often say negative things to him, but then other times he would, just a great guy. He just kind of had moods.
Right. And I think his stuff is more accepted now than it was when he was alive.
Yeah, so Doug Skinner read my book. He actually ordered him a copy and told me he felt that the approach I took was better than just a biography and dealing with his problems and stuff, that showing how what he wrote and described was potentially relevant to the ongoing, situation in the field, the high strangeness, crossover events. That's the kind of stuff that really got him in hot water when he, brought all that out. And, of course, strongly advocated for the ultra-terrestrial concept, that there was a parallel world. And of course, now with quantum physics being discussed so much, whether they're ultra-terrestrial or extraterrestrial, I'm like, who cares? I mean, if they can do all this anomalous physics and consciousness-related stuff, that's where we need to focus our attention.
Oh, definitely.
I mean, maybe they're both. Ivan Sanderson thought they had bases under the ocean. And Ivan Sanderson and John Keel originally were going to write a book together, but Keel decided to do Operation Trojan Horse on himself. I think what it was going to be is, I was just reading on the something that I guess Doug Skinner had posted on the johnkeel.com site, that they were going to write a book where they just presented a bunch of cases and didn't give any opinion. And what Keel wrote, Operation Trojan Horse, was certainly not that kind of book. So I think that was probably why they went their separate ways.
Well, when you're talking about the chupacabra in here, that's one of the things where I almost am dismissive of it, because it took off, and then you had mangy coyotes and stuff being called chupacabra, and it seemed to just get so watered down that it was really hard to see if there was anything significant to it. But you're presenting cases here that are very specific into a particular type of creature that was attacking animals and leaving very distinct marks.
Yeah, I try to get as much firsthand information as I could, and from researchers who were working closely on some of the initial outbreaks in Puerto Rico, and there was even some cases down in Chile, and some of those were pretty high strange events. Then, I've the same thing you're talking about. I don't know how many cases of what are obviously coyotes or some sort of dog that's, got the mange or something, and someone shoots it. It's a chupacabra,
Yes.
And it gets kind of crazy, more than just kind of crazy. and these things, you start looking for one thing and then something else comes up. But consciousness and physics of anomalous nature, that's really where our focus needs to be. And we all need to work together and be multidisciplinary. The cryptid people and the parapsychologists, the ghost hunters and the UFO hunters, they all need to come together, and all these other isms and ologies, and instead of trying to be a separate branch unto themselves. Right. Compare notes and see what comes of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So the beginning of this book, you talk a lot about the star people and things like that. And one of the things you bring up is the importance of the Pleiades in so many different cultures. What do you make of that today?
Well, I don't know. It's been there along with some other star systems, and there are so many legends about connected with the Pleiades or other places that where these beings a long time ago in different cultures around the world, they have stories, legends of superior beings that came down from the heavens, and they taught us, gave us knowledge of different things, of construction.
They were like the civilizers.
The civilizers, yeah, and there's so many of those stories, and then there's some that comparisons that can be made of like not only the Native American star people or the tricksters, but of the jinn of the Muslims, or the elementals of the Buddhist religion, and so on. And Anne Druffel a few years ago had been studying UFOs since 1957, and I mentioned her in this book. She wrote a book called How to Defend Yourself Against Alien Abductions. Yeah. And she talked about the Muslim jinn and the elementals and said there's a lot of similarities. They have sexual interest in us, and along with the Greys of today, they share our world, but in a hidden, they're with us, but in a hidden state. They like shape shift. They can look one way one moment, another way another, maybe screen memories we call it, or, but they go even deeper than that. They materialize and dematerialize, and they can abduct us and transport us to various realms or different locations. They have the missing time. The Gordon Crichton of England's Flying Saucer Review and Rosemary Guiley, who wrote the forward to my Keel book, they were all heavily involved in the whole jinn controversy themselves, and believe there was even a connection, with the beings we see in these contact cases and the jinn beings, because they noticed some very apparent similarities. Whether it's really the jinn or not, or just the fact that we're dealing with paraphysical components that are predominant with many different areas that we could explore, and I think that's why we need the folklorist, the mythologist, the anthropologist, all these people from all these different branches of science or inquiry to come together and be more open about these things. I was at the last Mothman Festival in Point Pleasant and had a table trying to sell some of my books, and there was a lady, a folklorist from Indiana, from a university in Indiana, and she's studying the Mothman as kind of an urban legend. So we talked a little, and I noticed in the 14 Times a story come out about her and the Mothman. They said Point Pleasant, Virginia, instead of West Virginia, but we'll forgive them. They're over in England. They don't know. But she, what it said was that she had commented about this Mothman statue there near the downtown section of Point Pleasant, and that people were rubbing in case you've ever been there or seen a picture of the statue from behind, he's got a big butt. And so people are taking their credit cards and they're putting it between his butt cheeks for good luck. And I think hopefully she'll find out more about Mothman of Relevance than that. But anyway.
Wow.
But anyway, I guess on a more serious level, there's certainly in my current issue of Alternate Perceptions, just came out, the June issue, Albert Rosales has an article about all these cases here in the United States and elsewhere involving birdmen or flying creatures, some of it kind of like Mothman, back in 1948. So 1947 was the year of the saucer, and 1948 was the year of the flying men. It was pretty interesting assembly of cases. The high strangeness has been there under our noses for a long time, and we don't really. A lot of people in the field don't even know a lot of the background and history to all this, and well, I'm still learning. It's pretty deep stuff.
Well, and I think there's always been that high strangeness. It's just how we name it and how we define it. Like we put stuff on that high strangeness. So at one point, of course, it was like the Fae. So whatever it was no matter how weird it was just the Fae.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting that a number of people who have, we try to say they're alien abductee. It's the ETs, and when you talk with them, they've had a lot more experiences than that. But a lot of the researchers have just not listened to it. They hear another story, well, they don't want to hear that. I've heard stories of people seeing fairies. That's or leprechaun types or gnomes. And I think a lot of the, ET researchers, when they come across that, if they're interested in the alien abductions, they just don't include that it out of their reports. It's not given mention. They only want that which, that'd be somebody else's field. And so they only want to give credence to the nuts and bolts ET,
And you get the same with any of this stuff. I mean, the book that Tim Renner and Joshua Cutchin just put out talking about basically the paranormal Bigfoot stuff. You talk about that in this book.
Mm-hmm. I definitely want to read their book. I was at the Strange Realities Conference in Nashville last fall, and they both gave a talk about what was going to be in that book, and it was phenomenal stuff. High strangeness for sure. And I have done an interview with Tim Renner, and we talked about some of his material, and it's pretty fascinating. It really is.
And you talk in here about the how many sightings of Bigfoot are associated with lights. You get a lot into lights in this book.
Yeah, and that's I've been hearing in touch with people just recently with similar stories of these lights, and one woman in Athens, Ohio, not too far from Point Pleasant, says that her and other people have been seeing a lot of these balls of light, even light beings, and she and a friend of hers watched one come up within about 2.5 feet, and all of a sudden, inside the light, they're both looking at this little fairy figure just inches high, and her friend, a male friend, was with her at the time, and they were both shocked. And it was several months later before they even brought it up again. They just it was just too much for them psychologically. They just kind of shut down.
Right. Yeah.
And she was someone who had studied a lot of folklore and mythologies and witchcraft and stuff, and about fairies. And she said it was like this experience was saying, you think you know about us, huh?
Well, that's kind of how it works, isn't it? Every time you think you got things figured out, it throws you a curveball.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Brad Steiger. I remember him. It's in my introduction here. He mentions of all these different theories that he's come up with. And he said at first each one sounded really good, and then there would be some sort of piece of evidence that would come along, and it would totally, like a house of cards, it would all just fall apart.
You also quote, oh my God, I can't remember his name. Your friend who's also part of the Search for Atlantis there.
Dr. Greg Little, yes.
That is who I'm thinking of, where he says, you can almost attribute all this stuff to sort of the plasma, out of body type of stuff, except for, there's those couple of things that just don't fit.
Yeah, Greg has, we've had a lot of discussions about this. He's been helping me with alternate perceptions beginning in 1985 when I was just a little 4-page print publication called Paraufology Forum. It's evolved. And then he came on board with me as, a co-editor in 93. And one of the things that, there's so many aspects to this. He believes that Keel, kind of with his super spectrum theory, was pretty close to the mark. There was manipulation of energies, energy beings, whatever you want to call it. He studied a lot of the Native American things, and I remember him telling me that the trickster being was could also be a teacher, and it was something that in the beginning of a vision quest, that the Native Americans would always expect that the trickster would appear, and its presence was to essentially test you and to see if you were worthy and of higher knowledge. And if you didn't get past the trickster, then and its web of deception, then you just stay right where you're at, and wouldn't evolve any further. And a lot of ufology is at that same level now, but but that if you could, you would get to higher truth, and you would find yourself exploring more relevant areas, and so on. But he's written a book recently with Andrew Collins called The Denisovan Origins.
Yes. Yep.
Studying a lot of ancient things there. And what's interesting about that culture is that they have some in the DNA. It seems some evidence of that they were kind of autistic people.
Oh right, yeah.
And that may be where we get that part of us, except that in their case, it's believed that they were kind of like mathematical geniuses. What's the word there for
savants?
Savants, yes, that they had this savant quality, like the Rain Man there. The toothpicks fall on the floor and he counts them just like that. And in fact, the guy who was the consultant for that movie, Rain Man, I have been in touch with him because he had commented about a case over in India involving a young girl who seemingly could read things from the mind of her mother. And newspaper journalists came and did some interviews with her and tested her and said that she seemed to display telepathy. And the guy who was a medical doctor who specializes in savants lives up in Michigan, and we got to correspond. I wanted to interview him, but he said he's had such a difficult time with, other medical people around him that he just can't say any more right now because it's pretty much a taboo medical thing, and it's sad. But you see people in near-death experiences, and after their encounter, they develop all these psychic gifts, and the same thing with contact experiences, and some of it's almost like a synesthesia, multiple sensing, and that's why I'm really interested in Nolan and Green's work with MRIs and doing medical studies and then studying the changes that may be occurring in the brain, because
Right.
I think that's where it's at. And but of course, in my book, I describe a lot of the, as you said, the shamanic elements, and a friend of ours, my wife's and mine, down in Hamilton, Alabama, Wanda Dove Tice, and actually it's Wanda Tice. Dove was actually a name we often called her because it was a name that she felt a spirit had given her, called her Dove. Mm-hmm. And she was of Cherokee and Choctaw ancestry, and she did a lot of sweat lodges, and so we got to meet her and attended sweat lodges at her home. Eventually had one built on the hillside here behind our house here in Waynesboro, Tennessee. And anyway, we found out that she, during the harmonic convergence back in 1987, was standing on the top of an Indian mound, a flat top Indian mound, somewhere west of Nashville. We're still not sure. I got an idea where it might have happened, but I'm not sure. She's not sure. But there were a group of people who were meditating on top of this mound, and somebody had brought the Peruvian whistling vessels. These were replicas, I'm sure. They weren't the original, but they were done to replicate the originals. And they were blowing them, and this seemed to affect her and the people who were on the mound with her. And she saw herself wearing a white tunic and this like golden sun disk right around the navel area, and feeling a vibration in the solar plexus. And then she says she heard other people there talking about seeing the same thing. And it was like, wait a minute, this is supposed to be my vision. And seemingly they were all at Machu Picchu in Peru. She had never been there, never has been there as of yet. And they're standing there, hands up in the air, and there's a starship in the sky. And there's a feeling that she was there long ago in the past, and even that she might have been an ET, and that she and the others had a feeling that maybe they had let their egos get the best of them, and that they were being left behind. Kind of a sad story there. But she was engaged in other things too, vision quest, and had these apparent memories of these tubes of energy that they would take and hide at sacred sites around the world, and even of a stargate with a kind of a water barrier, which she said it happened before the movie Stargate came out, and where they walked through this water, and this robed being had one of these tubes and went around her chakra areas, and the tube filled up with green slime, and said she felt it was taking the negative energy out of her, and making her more open to spiritual, positive things, and told a lot of interesting stories that, from a Native American perspective, are quite meaningful. Was one back in '86 where she had gone to South Dakota, and during a Sundance ceremony, and she participated in sweat lodges and saw some strange beams of light, connected with what was going on, and she said that in the very beginning, for this to happen, she was just stepped out on her porch one day, and a crow came down out of a tree, but then it hovered like a hummingbird, which is unlike a crow, and they made eye contact, and it spoke to her and told her she was going to South Dakota. And she didn't really see that happening, but then things lined up, and a friend contacted her and wanted to go to South Dakota, and so anyway, one thing led to another, and a lot of the things that bird had told her apparently came true. but it makes, you wonder on these kind of things, how they, compare to modern contact experiences, and the legends we hear and stories told by the Aboriginal people, whether they're Native American or Siberian or wherever they come from. And so many of them talk about these different worlds, and even though they're separated by thousands of miles, you hear the same kind of things, superior beings coming from the heavens. The world is divided up into the upper world, the middle world, and the lower world, and there's certain kind of beings in each one, and then these anthropologists or different researchers in anthropology go to these different tribes, say in South America, and they try their sacred sacraments, their mixtures, ayahuasca or San Pedro cactus, and then their hallucinogenic snuffs, and suddenly they find themselves seeing things that relate to the culture that they're in. I remember one was, I think it was Venezuela, and this it's in my book, and the guy described suddenly seeing this little man dancing at the edge of the forest, and he told a elder what he saw, and he says, "Oh yeah, he's always doing that, He's and he's." And then there was another one that was seeing these giant serpent-like beings, and there's different accounts told by different researchers who've been studying these different cultures and got daring and actually tried their hallucinogenic mixtures, and it just sort of opened up them to their world.
Right.
Not that I'm encouraging anyone out there to, to go on a drug-induced trip here, but it's just fascinating, those cases where it has happened. Even Dr. Andrew Puharich was studying hallucinogenic mushrooms at his laboratory up in Glen Cove, Maine, back in the 1950s. And one of his early subjects was Peter Urkos, and he gave him some to try to boost his psychic ability. And one time in November 1956, they were all outside one night at Puharich's home, his lab, whatever. And they saw this spherical object in the sky, and then they decided it was time to go to bed. And I guess don't know what that was, but anyway, about a half hour after Puharich had gone to bed, he suddenly got up, and I think it was early morning. He walked down to the ocean nearby, and there was this transparent object out on the water with 3 small figures inside, and they were staring at him. And I'm not sure what he did. Maybe he ran back to the house. But the next day he told Dr. Puharich what happened, and they went down there, and the tide was out, but out on the rocks where the object had been on the water, there was a burned area, he said. And of course, Dr. Rick Strassman, who did the DMT study at the University of New Mexico's School of Medicine in Albuquerque, New Mexico, he did a 5-year study from 1990 to 95, and he had 60 volunteers, and a number of them, their accounts reminded him of alien abduction accounts described in one of John Mack's books of abductees. Right. And he was fascinated by that. He was also fascinated that when he first went to talk to his volunteer patients, and say, okay, well, tell me about your unusual hallucination. And they told him, no, this was real. It was realer than real to him. And, so he had to sort of start playing along, and say, okay, well, tell me about this being, or the beings. What happened to you? What do you remember? He had to choose his words carefully. And then he started listening to him, and also being in touch with, I think, some quantum physicist, he got sort of open to the idea that maybe the DMT opened him up to multiverse, or some other dimensions. Maybe these were real.
Mm-hmm.
And when I read his book DMT, the Spirit Molecule, there was a part in there that talked about how he thought that maybe chanting, if the DMT there was DMT or DMT type substance associated in the pineal gland, that it maybe vibrated. The sound could vibrate it and induce a chemical release. So I wrote to him, as I had just done an interview with him, and he said, that was a possibility. I'd also mentioned about the Peruvian whistling vessels, and he said, yeah, I've experienced them, and they're pretty trippy. And I thought, whoa. And so he couldn't remember who it was that initially that had brought him to his house. And I said, it wasn't Don Wright of Silver City, New Mexico. That's it. That's the guy. Well, I got 4 of his vessels that he made him. They're replicas of, the original pre-Columbian whistling vessels. Mm. And there had to be powerful shamanic tools, I'm sure. And they are trippy. But what was interesting, it turned out he was one of his volunteers, one of the 60 people who tried the DMT. And I thought, wow, what a coincidence this is. So I got him to tell me his story, which I posted years ago. But anyway, Don Wright's DMT experience with various entities, and it's pretty bizarre. I think there's one being that looks like Gumby, and the other, and then there's another being that looks sort of like pyramid shaped with little eyeballs on it. But bizarre stuff.
Yeah, and I think it's hard to tell where, it's really easy for a materialist to dismiss this stuff and say, well, it's just, hallucinations and stuff. But the impact it has on the people who have these experiences, that feeling of it being more real than real and such. I mean, how do we define in our world what is real and what's not, other than by experience?
Yeah, and one of the things that John Mack and Dr. Strassman, I just read, they had gotten together and they had planned to have several abductees to try DMT and see if they could identify with their experience, connect, see if the DMT to them felt the same as the abduction experience. And of course, unfortunately, John Mack didn't live long enough to work that all out with Dr. Strassman, but there's certainly a lot of people still around who'd be interested in knowing the answer to that. So I hope that maybe eventually something like that might come to pass. But I was just contacted recently by a woman telling me a story about her experience out in Arizona with a medicine woman. Went on for about 3 days and given some sort of a tea with some sort of hallucinogen, and she said it was more real than real. She used those same words again. And she's also an experiencer. I mean, unrelated to that experience, she has for a long time had experiences with UFOs and strange lights, beings and stuff, and she has a son who has similar experiences. I think when he was about 3, he saw little people around his bed. So, it's just interesting. There's such a prevalence of these accounts floating around.
Oh, absolutely. I had actually whatchamacallit on for the DMT books, both of them, both the Spirit Molecule and the one he did after that, which was also interesting, where he's talking about the Old Testament, the prophets and stuff possibly having these same type of experiences.
Yeah, I was watching a video that really made me think about the fact that mushrooms were growing in the Garden of Eden and so on, That was the red apple.
And what do you make of the Native American star people type of stuff? Like, I mean, from what I can tell, these are just sort of matter of fact stories that you hear from various Native American cultures. Like, this stuff is just part of their accepted belief system.
Yeah, I was, it really is. Some of it now, nowadays, they're starting to read some of our stuff and really, I know when Brad Steiger said he first began to explore this angle, there were very few Native Americans who would really talk about it. The Cherokee were the first who would communicate with him about these experiences. Now it's become quite prevalent, and you have this lady out in Montana. I know she's written 3 books, one on urban Indians, one on the reservation Indians, and one on Central American Indians that she's gone down and interviewed and had a translator go from different places, and all 3 books. And her name is
Artie Sixkiller?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've had her on too. Yep. Yeah,
she is. I've interviewed her. It's a shame. I'm like, what was her name? Yes. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. There's so many, and I not too long ago I interviewed a lady out in Lincoln, Nebraska, who actually was a good friend of the Scott Colburn of Kazum Radio's Exploring the Unexplained, who just recently passed away toward the end of March. But she worked with him, and both of her parents are from reservations. One's Lakota from Pine Ridge, and the other one a reservation there in Nebraska. And she was telling me in an interview I did with her that they've had a lot of experiences on the reservation and in the area of the reservations, and that she would talk to her grandparents and tell them stories and about what people are reporting, the UFOs, and so we saw those way back, and
yeah.
It's pretty interesting. John Keel had stated that researchers interested in UFOs should go and go to reservations and try to befriend some Native Americans that spend a day of it, and get to win their confidence, and that you'd find out some very surprising things. He doesn't describe if he ever did it, but he kind of gives you that feeling that he had done it maybe, and he certainly emphasized that a person could come away with a lot of interesting information doing that.
Yeah. Well, I remember when I had Artie on the first time, I kind of had this, I'm reading through her books and her accounts, and it seemed very materialistic in sort of like the nuts and bolts ET way. But the more I got into it and the more I thought about it, the more I realized that we're dealing with a culture that doesn't necessarily separate materialism out the way we do. So it kind of puts a different twist on what they're describing. Like, it doesn't have to be material in the same way we're describing material to kind of connect in their culture. The spirit is a part of their culture,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they look at things a little different than we do.
Yeah,
and it's now in my book. There's a gentleman out in California who was a college teacher, and he was involved in Native American studies, and he was told by a medicine man that he was he was having these strange dreams about these eagles coming from the 4 directions and this strange humming sound.
Mm-hmm.
And this Native American elder told him, "Oh, well, that's the UFO people." And he got very upset with the guy and told him, "No, that's nonsense. No such thing. No such thing." And then one March, shortly after his birthday, he awoke from a dream with these birds again, and where they turned into UFOs. And then he woke up and there was a humming sound. He got up, walked to a picture window, and there was, he said, an honest-to-God flying saucer hovering there. And then there was a bright flash, and suddenly he was inside the saucer. And there were these Native American elders who were at the controls. And they took him for a ride, and he could look down on the earth below and see that there were different luminous areas, and that had to do something with power spots. And the whole thing was, revolved around the idea that there are energy centers and power spots, and that they're there to help to bring balance. And also there was, he was given different predictions, prophecies, or whatever. The difference was that a lot of them didn't come to pass, but he insists that by the time frame that he was given, but he says that that's actually based on how we respond. If, these things could come to pass, he said, but, and we need to pay attention to them and not try to do the wrong thing with our future endeavors. We need to prevent these things from happening.
Right. But he was also given messages about, like the environment and stuff, like so many people who have UFO encounters are given. Oh, yeah. And, of course, one of the big ones we hear from so many contact experiences from 1950s on to the current abductees is, of course, thermonuclear destruction of our world, and on top of that, we have, a guy who's written a whole book. I mean, I've seen these cases for years. Finally, someone put them all into a book about UFOs and nukes, and it's like, hey, that's pretty interesting. You've got the messages, you've got the sightings. Yeah, there seems to be something to this. What is it? Yeah. What is it? That's the key to everything, huh? Yeah, that should be the name of a book. What is it? Also, one of the things that's always interesting me, you spend a little time talking about the commonality of little people in a lot of these experiences, and I've noticed that too. Like even I pointed out, not that it's a great source, but I had been watching an episode of Ghost Adventures. And they were using one of those gaming devices that picks up, like you can walk in front of it and it'll show your stick figure outline type of thing. Mm-hmm. And at one point they're filming one of the guys, and you see this little figure pop up next to him. And they're going, well, what's that? And he goes, I feel weird. What's happening to me? And you see the figure sort of crawl up the side of him and start playing with his head. And I'm like, it's really interesting that it's small. Like, what is it with little beings, Yeah, it's, you get them with the DMT stuff, and you get them with people who are stewing in their own natural brain chemistry under conscious conditions. Terence McKenna, who wrote True Hallucinations, about going to Peru and trying to study how, the natives there used ayahuasca and things, and he did the mushrooms, and he claimed that at Berkeley back in his Berkeley days, they were seeing elfin entities, and he said there was a tribe down there in the upper Amazon that they studied, had a DMT plant mixture called Ukuhi, whatever that is, and that they communicated with little men. Of course, in my book, a lot of the stories in Peru back in the 60s and so on involved UFOs and these little people coming out. And one with a little man walking through a street of some downtown, little town down in Peru. But
And then you have these really strange things, giant cyclops beings, and
Right, yeah.
and little tin can type things, and there's a whole. I mean, before Communion and Intruders, was Strieber and Hopkins. I mean, ufology had had the Greys and stuff, but I mean, there were all kinds of beings. It seems a little more focused now, but it's.
Well, it seems more focused. You point out that it got more focused once those images entered our mainstream consciousness.
Yeah.
Then they became more this is what you see, and it's not so much that people are making it up, but it's almost like we put a camouflage on these things because we don't know how to perceive them correctly, and Strieber and Hopkins gave us that camouflage.
Yeah, and I know that Andrew Collins noted that once that happened, there were some people who actually began to see them as the being on the cover of Communion, more like that, as opposed to what they had originally described.
Mm-hmm.
And whether that was done consciously or unconsciously, or they were just trying to get with the times,
Yeah.
But I remember one story that emerged was some guy recognized the cover and said that they had a family member die in their home, and right afterwards they saw this strange being walking up the stairs, and they'd never seen anything like it until they looked on the cover of Communion, and that experience they had was back in 1937. And you think, wow, we got a lot of people now who are looking at near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, and connect them with alien contact encounters, close encounters of the third kind, the fourth kind, the fifth kind. And then you look at all these similarities between all these other beings from all these mythologies and legends of yesteryear, like the jinn and the elementals. And of course, Keel was, a lot of his ideas were revolving around the ultra-terrestrials, who we call the elementals. Supposedly the term ultra-terrestrials came from his friend Ivan Sanderson, but
I didn't realize. I guess I did know that. Now that I think about it.
Well, I haven't really seen proof positive, but somewhere along the line, somebody said that, and I don't know for sure, but they were, of course, they worked closely together. They were good friends, and so it's certainly quite possible. But Keel certainly made it his trademark when he used it.
Did you ever get to talk to Ivan Sanderson?
No, I never did. I've got some of his publications, the INFO Journal, but never did have direct contact with him. No, I'm interesting guy. I'm sure of that.
Oh yeah, definitely. I didn't always, like reading his books. It's like, okay, this is not necessarily the right answer, but he has interesting collections of information. He's not afraid to just throw stuff out there, kind of like Keel. He's not afraid to just put stuff out there.
Oh yeah, one of the things I mentioned in my Keel book was his experience years and years ago when he was a young man, and he was in a foreign country, and these little pebbles were falling around him, and he got the idea to put a mark on them and then throw them back into the night, and immediately they came back with the same marks he had marked them with. Mm-hmm. And he said there was no way that anybody could have reacted, not normally, that quickly. And then Tim Swartz, I was interviewing him one time, and he told me an experience he had when he was working for a TV station in Dayton, Ohio, some years back. And while they didn't want to cover the stories themselves, there was a family who reported their house was haunted. So just, on his own, he went to conduct an investigation, and said that while he was there was a couple of senior citizens who were looking after a little girl, little boy that was their grandkids. He could see them playing in their room, and the grandparents were right there in front of him. He's sitting inside the house. All of a sudden, these stones come falling from the ceiling. And it looked like they were materializing just a few inches below the ceiling. Mm-hmm. And he immediately thought of Ivan Sanderson. And so he, took a marker, marked him, and threw him out in the backyard, which was a small backyard surrounded by a field of corn all around this fenced-in backyard. And he threw him out into the corn. And he no sooner got back in the house and started to sit down and sip on coffee or whatever. And all of a sudden, these rocks came from the ceiling, and they were the ones he had just thrown out of the cornfield, And he says, "Oh, wait a minute." And he says, I even went up and looked into the attic, he said, I don't know, after what I had seen, what I expected to find. But anyway, he tried to be objective and scientific. And he said after his visit, the activity stopped. And the couple were very grateful and said, "Oh, thank you so much. We were really getting scared." And he's there. "Well, I don't know what I did. I just came to investigate." And they had never had that experience of these stones falling, from the ceiling like that. And his response, what he did and how it came, how it came about. And then I just as I was about finished in that part of my book, I came across a story about the Bell Witch and how these young boys were walking by a bush, and supposedly the Bell Witch was tossing these sticks at him. And there was a young older guy standing nearby, saw what was going on. They'd throw the sticks back, and the sticks would come back to him. And so he went over and he had a knife and he made some notches in the sticks and then threw them back. And they came back with the notches, I said, okay, so it happened a third time.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
So there's just a lot of things. And then, right now I'm working with some people who are paranormal investigators. This just started, and it looks like a very reputable case. One of these people is an archaeologist who also has degrees in anthropology, and is been doing paranormal investigators for a number of years, but decided to investigate a UFO experiencer. And what happened is one moment the experiencer says, "Oh, there's a light in the sky." So they're gathering their equipment together, and they're going to get audio. They've done EVPs. They want to see if they can get EVPs, get photographs, and then all of a sudden, their instruments are on the ground and they're coming back to consciousness, kind of weaving and feeling nauseated, standing close together. And they go into the guy's house, and the wife says, "Where have you been? I've been looking for you, for quite a while, and you haven't been around." And they were outside, should have been able to have found them, but they had the missing time. And then as they were leaving, a craft flew up into the air ahead of their car. And anyway, this is on the, you'll find it in, I think, the last issue of Alternate Perceptions, where I did an interview with Kathleen Martin, who's, of course, the niece of Betty Hill, and is, does hypnosis, very involved in UFO investigations for MUFON, and also worked with the Free Organization. And she allowed me to get in touch with one of the archaeologists, and there's two ladies involved, one from North Carolina, one from Georgia. And anyway, we've been comparing EVPs, mine like with John Keel, and another audio that I've had from working with the Ghost Box, and what they get with SB7, and some of it is just really similar. In fact, I often get a voice saying Philip, and they have a file on Philip. I also regularly get Bishop, and they've got one audio that they've made a note of that says Bishop. But they've gotten some very interesting, interactive type, meaningful spirit contacts. Also some that seems to relate to aliens. So, I'll... because none of this surprises me really that much at this point, but it's quite intriguing, and so it's and I discovered that she actually, this lady had the archaeologist had sent me back one of my audios, and I had asked the spirits, we thought that maybe they wanted us, because I just interviewed this guy and there were some unusual sounds in the background. And I asked him to say this guy's name. And this happened a number of times. I'd ask him to say his name and they'd say his first and last name. In one instance, there was like a sing-song voice. And it was on the audio I sent him, and I didn't even really take note of it. And then once I heard it, I thought, oh, I've heard that before in some of my other audio, And,
right.
It's like, oh. And then one of them I sent him was like, when we first started this, my friend Brett Oldham, who's an abductee and a psychic, we were at this site not far from where I live here, down in a place called Clifton. And he got John Keel twice. I just played it again, and I'm hearing John Keel Brent. I was so focused on just the John Keel, I didn't hear the Brent part. And I have another audio I recorded several years later here at my house with my own ghost box saying John Keel Brent, Bert here. Bert was a psychiatrist friend, Bert Schwartz, who I corresponded with like 37 years, and he was a friend of John Keel's. And, I'm thinking, so I've had this John Keel Brent thing before, It's just but it's just kind of, it's weird. It's not just kind of weird. It's just weird, and this part of the crossover stuff.
One of the things you talk about in here is something that I've done a number of shows on, which is Kundalini. But you talk about it obviously a little differently than I do, since mine was a spontaneous awakening, but you kind of compare across cultures the whole chakra Kundalini thing.
Yeah, and I'm hearing that, there's apparently an increase among experiences with sort of Kundalini chakra type things going on. But I'm also thinking that it's probably been around for a long time, but people are just becoming aware of it. I mean, I know I interviewed a woman in Ohio in 1975 when I spent about two and a half months on the road just going around interviewing people, and she was telling me about this experience where it sounded like Kundalini, and it was kind of a healing thing, and this thing went up her spine to her, like, the top of her head, and she visualized this ball of energy, and she had a healing, and I thought that's very Kundalini-like in her description,
Yeah.
And Brad Steiger in early 70s wrote about some cases that involved Kundalini-type experiences, and in one case I know there was like a healing involved in it. And so I think as we delve more and more into these experiences, we're gonna hear more and more of these type things.
Well, and I've often compared the Kundalini experience to sort of a shamanic awakening, especially when it happens spontaneously. And it may just be that, maybe there's a certain percentage of people that are supposed to have that awakening, and in our culture, we just don't have it.
Right. I saw a YouTube video of Carl Jung, who would have loved to have been, if he was still around, studying all the stuff that we're talking about now.
Oh, yeah.
He last book he wrote was devoted to the UFO phenomenon and trying to apply it to his theories of archetype of the collective unconscious or whatever. But he was describing a woman who had no familiarity with Eastern religions and stuff, and it was a Kundalini experience that she was describing, and he spent about 10 minutes talking about that case. And but.
And serpents are such a common symbol as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, serpents and like bird symbols.
Yeah.
And,
I mean, even with like ayahuasca, what you get is serpents again,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, serpents and little people, and occasionally weird birds with red eyes or whatever.
Right, and lights are everywhere.
Lights are everywhere. Yeah, and I remember Dr. Hynek, J. Allen Hynek, talking about some of these high strangeness cases and things, and making the comment like, it was like he could just visualize himself in his later years sitting somewhere in front of a fireplace, putting logs on the fire and talking about his best UFO cases like people tell ghost stories,
Yeah.
And, I remember reading in a book that he and Valley collaborated on back in 1975. And, Hynek was talking about how he was talking about apparitions, and he was interested in it. And but he said at the same time, some people will see a ghost or an apparition, and other people nearby don't. And said we don't have that with UFOs. If one's around, everybody sees it. And I'm thinking, wait, doctor, no, that's not right. There are cases where there are some pretty strange cases. Some people see it, some people don't. And there's one case in that Dr. Jung's book, Flying Saucers and Mysterious Things Seen in the Sky, where he was at a seance, and there was him and four other people, and they were seeing this moon-shaped object hovering over the abdomen of a medium. I don't know if he was in trance or what, he didn't say, but said the other four people could see it, and they expected that Jung could see it. He couldn't. He called it the psychoid factor. And he wondered if that happened with the UFO phenomena, and it has. I mean, there's a MUFON investigator, Angela Shear. I've talked to her, and she just come out with a book of her own UFO cases, and she lives up in Nashville, and she describes one of her first cases that revealed to her the high strangeness of these experiences. There were 12 people on a beach. 4 of them could see this object doing all this, doing its UFO thing out over the water. They could clearly see it, but all the other 8 people standing with them, having it pointed out, couldn't see it. And
right.
And I just heard about this, I'm investigating this spook light down here in Alabama, about 35 miles from where I am, and going out sky watching with some people who have been at this since about 1977. They've got like over 200 photographs. And anyway, he tells about one farmer who was seeing it, this ball of light flying across the field, and there's another farmer nearby, and he says, "Hey, look at that." And he says the guy should have seen it, but he just looked, and he says, "What? I don't see anything. What are you talking about?"
Yep. And I've had a few experiences of my own like that, where I've seen something, or I in both cases, me and someone else had seen something, but a third person didn't. And it really makes you question what's going on with reality at that moment. Like, is it just that they're not in tune with it? Are they blocking it out? Or are we literally experiencing slightly different realities?
Yeah. Yeah. And I know some years back, there was a friend of mine who was a ufologist, like myself, or whatever I am. Maybe I'm a 14 ufologist at this point.
Yes, 14, I'd go with that.
But anyway, he he wrote from Arizona, and he had a case where a craft landed, and there were several people, and they saw all these little people getting out. And he said, but they didn't all see him the same way. You know, one saw the conventional gray type, and the others saw just something different. And, you know, what's up with that? And some people speculate, well, the reason some people don't see it is that the person that sees it, they're able to look into the electromagnetic spectrum in a different part that the others can't. But I think it's a little more complicated than that. Yeah.
I think because there's such a direct connection to our consciousness when this stuff is happening.
Yeah, and that should be obvious from the get-go because, you know, I think in the majority of your contact cases, the ones that even the nuts and bolts ufologists accept as abductions, again and again we hear they didn't talk a lot of the times in English or their language. They use mind-to-mind, like telepathy, you know, and they take them through solid walls. Hello.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. High strangeness.
We are just about out of time, so why don't you tell people where they can find your magazine, your website, and you?
Okay, well, it's apmagazine.info, and we put out a monthly issue on the first of each month. It's Alternate Perceptions, and we have various articles, columns, freelance articles, interviews, book reviews, and letters to the editor. And, of course, we have news links from various things that we see that's posted that is, like I've got one in the current one on a study of DMT experiences that I thought was quite interesting. Hundreds of experiences who've done DMT and what they've experienced. And in view of what we've just talked about, it's quite interesting. And then, of course, I can be reached at BrentRaynes@yahoo.com. That's BrentRaynes, and it's all like one word at yahoo.com.
And you're on Facebook as well.
And I'm on Facebook as well. Yep. Thanks for mentioning. I also have an Alternate Perceptions on Facebook as well.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me again, Brent.
Well, Seriah, thank you very much for having me. And I always have a good time chatting with you. This is our fourth interview now.
Correct.
Very nice.
And we were talking about a lot of the stuff in your book, Visitors from Hidden Realms, which came out 2004 and is, of course, available on Amazon.
That's correct.
Right. I'd like to take a moment here to thank all of my Patreons, especially in this tough time. Your donations mean a lot. You are literally keeping this show going. So thank you so much. And an extra special thanks to those pledging $10 or more. Allison Cook, Lindsay Trebet, Super Inframan, Tim, David Moore, Vincent Trewell, The Great Change, Stone Wilderness, Luke Osborne, Becky Trainer, Rob Drummond, Alex Whitcomb, Damian Tallman, Edu Kamahort, Tactical Therapist, Janet Bunderson, 36 Dingo, Maria, Sam Sharon, Jennifer Campbell, American Rambler, Kevin, John Rutledge Foster, Eric Citron, Andy McNamara, Sasha Jorg, Matthias Sunby, Dominic O'Malley, Christopher Vaughn, Riker and Stark, Jose A., Roger Gonzalez, Craig Cicernos, Ray Benedetto, Linz Jackson K., Alfred Tuttle, Matthew Sproul, Kevin Schreck, Patricia Giaquinta, William Lovelace, Mark Brady, Chris 646, Carla Mahoney, and James Lattimore. Thank you all so very much. All right, so that was technically part one of at least two-part interview I'm going to be doing with Brent here on this book. There was still a bunch of stuff I wanted to talk to him about, so we'll probably be doing part two next week. I also have some other cool stuff I have yet to post. That will be up soon. And hey, we have merch. I never mentioned this. I'm trying to do better about that, but we have merch. Go to the website, wheredidtheroadgo.com. and click on the merch store, or on YouTube, on the newer videos, there's merch underneath that too, and it's slightly different too. And I will see you next time. You have been listening to Where Did the Road Go? This show is made possible in part from our Patreons, and we thank you and everyone listening for helping us continue this exploration of the strange. You can always find everything Where Did the Road Go related at www.wheredidtheroadgo.com. And thank you so much for your support.